Hello everyone, good day to all of you. Today I will be discussing about one of the theories of second language acquisition, which is called the Sociocultural Theory. Okay, Sociocultural Theory, or SCT, originated from the Russian psychologist named Vygotsky and his colleagues. So it argues that the human mental functioning is a mediated process. Anyway, we will talk about what is a mediated process later. Okay, it is based on three principles. First is that human consciousness is social rather than biological. Second is that human activity is mediated by material artifacts such as computers. And the third is that when we understand human activity, development should be holistic. Okay, so first we will be dealing with the constructs of this sociocultural theory. I know you already know what constructs are. Constructs are what makes a theory. So there are four constructs of this sociocultural theory. First, we have mediation. Second, regulation. Third, internalization. And the last one is the ZPD, or zone of proximal development, which I'm pretty sure you're very familiar about. Second is we will also dive into the researches and studies for it to be connected to second language acquisition. So we will be dealing with evidences, the misconceptions, and the observed findings. And lastly, of course, we will be summarizing this discussion with a conclusion and additional questions. Okay, so SLA, or second language acquisition, is seen to be as a psychological process in this theory that accounts higher mental processes. Okay, so for introduction, particular attention is given to development in instructed settings, especially for us language teachers, where activities and environments may be intentionally organized in order to guide developmental processes. So if you want to apply or use this theory, so as a language teacher, you should give attention to instructed settings, activities, and organizing environments. Okay, so first, the constructs. So again, we have the four constructs. Those are mediation, regulation, internalization, and the ZPD, or zone of proximal development. So mediation is the central or principal construct of the sociocultural theory. Regulation is the one that connects mediation and internalization, while internalization is where language takes function. Okay? And then, next is the ZPD, the fourth construct of the theory, which is defined as the development with guide. We'll be dealing with that a lot later on. Okay. We'll go to mediation, which is the central construct of this theory. It is defined as wherein symbolic artifacts, okay? Symbolic artifacts could be language, literacy, numeracy, or any other concept that you can think of. These are active artifacts that mediate between the individual, which is us, and the social material world. Next is concrete tools mediate relationship of humans and the physical world. Concrete tools are those material tools or tangible tools like the computers, how our environment is built, or anything that you can see in the environment. Example of mediation is when we dig a hole by our hands. Now, when we imitate other animals who digs a hole only by using their hands, we are doing a non-mediated activity. But if we use a shovel or a backhoe in digging, then we are engaged in a mediated activity. That is how these concrete tools mediate the relationship of us humans and the physical world. Also, we use mediation for our activity to be more effective and efficient. Okay, next. Still on mediation. Now let's go to regulation. Regulation is defined as the important form of mediation. Okay, this is where words reshape perception. Like example, a kid learns that an apple is different from a balloon. A kid learns that walking is different from running. So this is where regulation happens. When words reshape the perception of a language, a shift happens. And there are three types of shift under regulation. We have object regulation, we have other regulation, and we have self-regulation. Let's talk about object regulation. Example of this is when we use dictionary to find the meaning of a word. That is an example of object regulation. We use objects, okay, for regulation, for these words to reshape perception. Next is other regulation. So we always do this, especially us as teachers. Every time we check a work of a student, and then we put or write some comments or feedback on that work, that means it is an example of other regulation. Other regulation is when you use other people for regulation or for learning. Okay, next is self-regulation. This is the most important type of shift in regulation. Self-regulation. Self-regulation is needed to be a proficient user of second language. From the term self-regulation, this is where you internalize by yourself already. And remember that this self-regulation is not always a stable condition. Okay. Let's go back to mediation by symbolic tools. So mediation by symbolic tools, again, symbolic tools are like, examples are language, literacy, numeracy, or any other concept that you can think of. Okay? Mediation by symbolic tools is cognitively directed. Okay? It involves planning and rational thinking. Now, these two now constitutes our human consciousness. It also controls mental processes. So, language is seen as a cultural artifact. Actually, it is seen as the most powerful cultural artifact that mediates the human and the world, and between humans, okay? So it mediates connection to the world. Still, mediation by symbolic tools, again, language is seen as a unit of social interaction and thinking, okay? Now we have a new term which is called private speech. Private speech is what you call the individual's externalization of language by themselves, or self-regulation. Examples are collaborative plays and group activities in a second language classroom. Now, how come that the examples for self-regulation from the word self are collaborative plays and group activities? Why? Because when a language learner develops his or her private speech, or is having self-regulation, when he or she uttered that private speech or self-regulation, now it becomes a public display for collective attention. So you get me? Remember, if your learner or a language learner is processing private speech or self-regulation, he or she needs to apply that. Now, how does he or she apply that? Of course, he or she needs to utter his or her own private speech or self-regulation. Now, when he or she utters that, it becomes now a public display for collective attention. Example, when you are having an oral recitation, you call this one student, okay, and after he or she externalizes language, okay, so you call him or her, and then when he or she answers or utters his or her own self-regulation, it becomes then a public display for collective attention. Now, when he or she answers, his or her classmates will be listening to him or her, to his or her self-regulation that is now uttered. So that is how you maybe wondered why collaborative play and group activities are examples of self-regulation. Okay, let's proceed. Let us go to the third construct of sociocultural theory, which is internalization. Now, what is internalization? It is also seen as a process. Well, all the constructs of sociocultural theory are process: mediation, regulation, internalization. Now, internalization is seen where cultural artifacts, of course, including language, now they take on a psychological function. Okay, so internalization describes two planes. We have social plane and psychological plane. Now, any function in the child's cultural development appears twice. Okay, this appears on social plane and on psychological plane. When it appears on social plane, this is between people as an interpsychological category. Now, when it appears on the psychological plane, this is within the child as intrapsychological category. Okay, so what are the cognitive resources for this internalization? Of course, planning will always be there. Okay. And categorization. Okay, for interpretative strategies. These processes are initially social before they are being internalized as cognitive resources. Now, exposure, the language learner, of course, should be exposed to language, or the learner should be exposed to language and literacy, numeracy and mathematics, and even historical cultural practices for internalization to happen. Now, we will then learn after that exposure, the teacher will then learn the learner's capacity to perform complex functions. Now, the goal of this internalization, of course, is to decrease external mediation. External mediation includes, I think, the other regulation, diba? Asking help or aid from others. The goal of this internalization, because the learner needs to internalize, is to decrease external mediation and to increase his or her own internal mediation for internalization to happen. Now let's go to the last construct of this sociocultural theory, which is the ZPD, or the zone of proximal development. So for teachers listening out there, I'm pretty sure that this is very familiar to you already. Okay, but anyway, let's go back to the definition. So accordingly, it is the distance between actual developmental level and the level of potential development under adult guidance. So do you understand that, or should I give an example? Okay, example, this is how we teachers do a diagnostic test. The example, we give them a diagnostic test or a pre-test, and then after that we check it, and then we learn to see which item or which learning they have difficulty with. Now, we don't stop there, okay? We also, it's kind of like we also predict what they can still do in the future because we trust in them, okay? We know they still have a lot of learning to do. It's not just there. We just did a pre-test, okay? We will still be doing a post-test anyway. So, yeah. Okay, one misconception about ZPD is that it is linked to assisted performance. But please remember that assisted performance is not equivalent to ZPD, or zone of proximal development. But it has only been a driving force behind the interest in Vygotsky's research, okay? It is just like, it is just the interest or the inspiration of Vygotsky to develop zone of proximal development, and that is assisted performance, okay? That is just his inspiration for this ZPD. Okay, this is the line that which interested me most. It's what one did today is what one can do in the future. So I think that's how you understand ZPD, or zone of proximal development. What one did today, or what your learner did today, is what one can do in the future. Is what he or she can do in the future. Okay. So the ZPD is an educator's tool used to understand students' emerging capacities. They have these hidden abilities that we need to discover, okay, for them to use it in the future, for sure. And it is also used to analyze relationship between feedback and learning. We know that learning is constant. Now, when we go to ZPD, let us try to see if what happens when our feedback is also constant, or if it's not. Okay. Third is, if learners work together, strengths and weaknesses may be pooled. Okay. And then, a social cognitive tool, that is the ZPD, is used by mediating construction of knowledge. So to we use ZPD to test how our learners construct knowledge. Okay, let's go to, we're done with the constructs of this theory. Let's go to researches and studies. So what are evidences that this theory is being applied and used? Of course, these evidences must have a historical perspective. Like there should be a timeline, because this using this theory, you should have a record. Next is that learning takes place during interaction. So interaction is very important in this theory. And then I want you to remember this one. Development arises in self-talk. So that's why we had our private speech and self-regulation earlier, because that's where development arises. Okay. The performance could be seen in two types. It could be overt independent and other mediated performance. When you say overt independent, the development or performance can be seen if the learner already accepts the responsibility that he or she is needs to learn that language already, or has learned that language already. Next is other mediated performance. Other mediated performance is just like other mediated regulation. That is where you see other mediated performance. Okay. This theory also believe that traditional language tests, the standardized tests, they only offer limited evidence of development. Okay. This theory actually negates standardized tests. Okay. Now, if there is a change in control over the language over the learner's second language, he or she can then regulate the behavior of the self and of others. Okay, what are the common misconceptions about SCT or sociocultural theory? Okay, first is that ZPD is not equivalent to scaffolding. Okay, ZPD is not equivalent to assisted performance, like the misconception earlier. Okay, ZPD uses dynamic assessment. So from the term dynamic, that means changing assessment. That is why it negates to standardized tests. This theory negates to standardized tests because the assessment should be dynamic. Example of this is when you have two children. You give them a similar task performance, but what happens now is they respond differently, especially if you offer them prompts, models, or any other learning aids that you can offer. So that is how your assessment matters. It is very dynamic. Okay, let's have one study, an exemplary study by Poner in 2009. It talks a lot about DA or dynamic assessment. The aim of dynamic assessment is to move beyond judging learning performance as correct or incorrect. So that is why it very negates to, it opposes, it's kind of like it opposes the standardized test. Example, this is when a teacher or a language teacher carefully prepares mediating prompts for learners' difficulties. Example, when we notice or observe that our student has learning difficulty in this lesson, we then try to give him or her, remedial instruction or whatever that we can do for him or her to learn more or better. We call these prompts, okay? Prompts could be implicit. So, if the prompt is implicit, that means that we allow the learners to detect their own errors, okay? But when a prompt is explicit, that means that we, the teacher, provide the correct response. Okay. So, as teachers, of course, if you want to use dynamic assessment, you really need to record the number of prompts that you offered to each student, because assessment is very dynamic, it is very changing. It should not be uniform, okay? You remember that. Now, ZPD or zone of proximal development is an activity that could be done in an individual or group level. Or we have this GDA or group dynamic assessment. Now, how do you do that? Example, this is when, you have 3 students. You ask the first student a question. of course, that student 1 will answer. It could be wrong or right, whatever. Now you ask the student 2. You discover that the student 2 has better answer than student 1. Why? Because student 2 is observing student 1 and you a while ago. What more if you ask student 3? Student 3 has the best answer. How come? Because student 3 has been observing student 1, student 2, and you. Okay, and you. Okay, a while ago. So that is how group dynamic assessment is being done. Okay. Now, I also want you to remember this, that to perform in a fully self-regulated manner, it always requires appropriate self-evaluation. That is why I kept repeating self-regulation and the development of private speech earlier. When it comes to dynamic assessment, the teacher or the language teacher should always initiate inquiry into mediation. This is kind of related to the input, output, and interaction process of second language acquisition, in which the input for dynamic assessment and ZPT is inquiry, to initiate inquiry. We don't just feed them the knowledge itself, okay? We initiate inquiry for mediation to happen. This is done especially on fronted groups and for class interaction. Okay, now what are the observed findings in second language acquisition? The perspective is that we are all social individual. That's why interaction is very important. Next is that in second language acquisition, exposure to input is necessary and it's very important. And that this happens incidentally. What do you mean by incidentally, ma'am? It's like, when you read something and then you find this difficult word, and then so you try to find a dictionary or find the meaning of that word online. That just happens incidentally. That means that there is already an acquisition of a new learning, or it could be a second language. Now, let's go to speech. The speech is what we call the learner's output. Okay? Now, it follows paths and then it limits effects of instruction. Okay? Because speech is also dynamic. Okay, another findings includes the second language learning is variable in its outcome and across linguistic subsystems. Now, what are the limits? The limits are the effect of a learner's first language on SLA. When you teach a learner a second language, his or her native language will always matter. His or her first language will always matter because that's what he or she used to think, to communicate. Okay? Other limits could include effects of output on language acquisition. So that is why the first or native language of your learner will always matter. Okay, let's go to explicit and implicit second language knowledge. So, a second language learner could have explicit and implicit knowledge of a second language. So, this is kind of connected or related to the procedural or declarative theory, which is reported by our previous reporter. Now again, it says that we have a brain that has two memory systems. We have procedural and declarative. Declarative memory, which is also involved in second language acquisition. Now, in the knowledge of the learner about second language, we need to do explicit instruction, okay, or systematic instruction for them to acquire that second language knowledge. Okay, we can't just let them work independently for them to have their implicit knowledge. Well, of course they could, but it would really help if we do explicit instruction and systematic instruction. We have this another term, STI, or what we call systemic theoretical instruction. Okay, STI or systemic theoretical instruction. We already have assessment, we have dynamic assessment. Now, how do we do an instruction before that? We use this STI or systemic theoretical instruction. Now, what is STI or systemic theoretical instruction? The concept is that it is not simplified, it is not uniform, but it is systemic. Okay, it is processed, and it should be age appropriate, of course, and then that maintains integrity of the language. There's not much change on the language to be learned. Okay. STI is the use of schemata. Okay. And the use of images and models or any learning aids that you could offer as much as possible just to introduce the concept. Okay. Now the second language knowledge of the learner is very explicit in nature. But even though it is explicit, the quality of the knowledge should always be systematic and theoretical. Okay? So in conclusion, again, we have the 4 SCT constructs. We have mediation, regulation, internalization, and the ZPD or zone of proximal development. We also have dynamic assessment and systemic theoretical instruction in structuring educational intervention. So this DA and STI is used for educational interventions. I really hope you could use it as well, especially when the face-to-face classes return. So we'll be hoping for that one. Okay, and then sociocultural theory is used to improve educational processes and environments. And then sociocultural theory engage, of course, critical inquiry. This inquiry is our input, the input that we should do, okay, that we should deliver to the students for them to develop critical inquiry, and then for us to develop materials for positive interventions. These materials could also be used as prompts. It could be explicit or implicit prompts. It also studies psychological development, and it also impacts that development. And then lastly, this theory, sociocultural theory, understand communicative process as cognitive process, and that we are all social individuals. Okay, so here are some additional questions that you can ponder on, or you could answer this in your reaction or reflection paper as well if you try to choose this theory as your interest. First is, this is just sort of a review anyway. So what is mediation? What is its purpose? And what tools do learners use? Now, how could this theory, sociocultural theory, account for language learning outside the classroom, especially now that we are doing modular learning and online learning? Do you think we could use this theory? How could this theory be used? So you gotta brainstorm for that one. Next is, how does dynamic assessment principle provide mediation? And what is the focus of STI or systemic theoretical instruction? How does this instruction work? If you were to conduct a replicated study about sociocultural theory, what is it or what would be it? And lastly, do you think you unconsciously used sociocultural theory before? Explain any changes that you would make and what motivates you for such changes. So that is all, everyone. I hope you enjoyed listening, and if you still have questions, you can always message me. So thank you for listening, everyone. Have a good day and stay safe. Thank you.